Okay, so you want to own a hospital. A big building full of beds, doctors, and machines that go beep. People will always get sick. They can't skip the bill the way they skip a restaurant. Insurance companies send money every single day. It sounds like the most recession-proof business on earth. Everybody needs it. Nobody can shop around when they're bleeding, and the customers keep coming whether the economy is booming or falling apart. Sounds simple. It is not simple. And the story of how hospitals actually make money and how they actually die is one of the strangest stories in all of American business. Before you make a single dollar, you have to survive buying the thing or building it. A hospital is not a small purchase. Building a full-service medical center from scratch is one of the most expensive construction projects a private company can take on. When you add up the land, the steel, the specialized wiring for imaging machines, the plumbing for surgical suites, the backup generators, the medical gas lines, and the mountain of state and federal building codes that come with a place where people are cut open and kept alive on machines, a single new hospital can run past $1 billion before it admits its first patient. Industry estimates often put the cost of building a hospital at somewhere around $1 to $2 million per bed. So a modest 300-bed hospital can carry a construction bill of several $100 million all by itself. Buying an existing hospital is usually cheaper up front, but that's where things get interesting, because not all hospitals are the same hospital. There is an enormous gap in this industry between a hospital in a wealthy suburb and a hospital in a struggling small town, even if the two buildings look almost identical from the parking lot. One sits near families with private insurance that pays generous rates. The other sits near patients on government programs that pay far less, and near people with no insurance at all. Same beds, same machines, completely different businesses. Some rural hospitals have effectively been given away or closed entirely because the income they produce cannot cover the cost of keeping the doors open, while hospitals in rich metro areas trade for enormous sums. So here is the first thing nobody tells you when they picture owning a hospital. You're not really buying a building full of beds. You're buying a bet on who walks through the door and who's paying their bill. And the location tells you almost everything about which bet you're making. Most hospitals in America, by the way, aren't owned the way you'd own a business you'd expect to keep the profit from. Roughly half of the country's community hospitals are nonprofit. A nonprofit hospital pays no federal income tax and often no property tax, and in exchange it's supposed to provide what's called community benefit, meaning charity care and services for people who can't pay. Then there are for-profit hospital companies, the largest of which own dozens or even over 100 hospitals at once. HCA Healthcare, the biggest of them, operates well over 150 hospitals and takes in tens of billions of dollars in revenue every year, spreading the risk of any single hospital failing across a much bigger portfolio. That's a very different game than the one facing a private buyer who puts everything into one building in one town. And then there's a third structure that quietly reshaped the whole industry. Some owners sold the actual real estate underneath their hospitals to specialized landlords, real estate companies like Medical Properties Trust that exist specifically to own the ground under hospitals, and then rented the buildings back. It let them pull a huge pile of cash out of the property, but it also meant the hospital now had to pay rent forever on a building it used to own. Keep that arrangement in mind, because it's going to come back at the end of this story with a body count. And here's something strange about even getting into this business in the first place. In a lot of the country, you're not allowed to just decide to build a hospital. More than half of the states have what are called certificate of need laws, rules that require you to prove to a government board that the community actually needs a new hospital, or a new wing, or sometimes even a single expensive new machine, before you're allowed to build it. The stated purpose is to stop wasteful duplication. The practical effect is that the hospitals already in a market can often fight to block a competitor from ever opening its doors. So the barrier to entry isn't only the billion-dollar price tag. In many places, it's a permission slip that the people you'd be competing against get to argue against. That's a moat most industries would kill for, and it's written into law. Then there's how the money gets raised, because almost nobody builds a hospital out of pocket. Nonprofit hospitals frequently fund construction by issuing tax-exempt municipal bonds, essentially borrowing from investors at lower interest rates because the interest is shielded from tax. That cheap debt is a genuine advantage, but it's still debt. The hospital now owes interest and principal on hundreds of millions of dollars year after year, whether the beds are full or empty. A hospital's credit rating becomes one of the most important numbers in its whole existence, because if that rating slips, the cost of borrowing climbs, and a building that runs on borrowed money can't afford for its money to get more expensive. Say you've settled on a hospital and the price seems reasonable. Before you collect a single insurance check, there's a layer of costs and obligations that catches almost every new hospital owner off guard. First, there's the payer mix you inherit, and you don't get to change it. The people in your area are already on whatever insurance they're on. If your neighborhood is full of retirees on Medicare and low-income families on Medicaid, that is your customer base, and those programs decide what they'll pay you. You inherit whatever hand the location deals you, good or bad. Second, there's the law that sits on top of everything. Any hospital with an emergency room that takes Medicare, which is nearly all of them, is legally required to examine and stabilize anyone who shows up in an emergency, regardless of whether that person can pay a single dollar. It's called EMTALA, and it means your emergency department is not a normal business. You cannot turn away the customer who can't pay. You have to treat them, and then you find out later whether you'll ever see a cent. That's a cost you sign up for the moment you own the place. Third, there's the equipment. An MRI machine can cost over $1 million. Surgical robots run into the millions. Every one of those machines gets old, breaks down, and gets replaced by a newer model that the hospital across town is already advertising. If the previous owner was cutting corners on maintenance to make the cash flow look healthy on paper, you find that out the first time a critical machine fails in the middle of a Tuesday. Here's where it gets interesting, because the way a hospital makes money is more layered and more bizarre than almost anyone realizes. The first layer is the price nobody actually pays. Every hospital keeps a master list of prices for everything it does, from a single aspirin to open heart surgery. This list is called the chargemaster, and the numbers on it are almost pure fiction. A bag of saline solution that costs the hospital $1 or $2 might appear on the chargemaster at over $100. But almost no one pays that number. It's a starting point, a sticker price on a car that everyone knows will be negotiated down. Picture a surgery that shows up on a hospital bill at $100,000. A commercial insurer might have a contract that says it pays $30,000 for that procedure. Medicare might pay $15,000, Medicaid might pay $8,000, and the uninsured patient gets mailed the full $100,000 bill and pays, on average, almost none of it. 4 different patients, 1 identical surgery, 4 completely different amounts of money. Understanding this is the key to understanding the entire business, because in a hospital, the price of a thing and the money the hospital actually collects for that thing have almost nothing to do with each other. The second layer is where the real action is, and it's called the payer mix. This is the single most important number in the whole business. The exact same procedure, done in the exact same room by the exact same surgeon, earns wildly different amounts of money, depending only on who is paying for it. A private commercial insurance plan might pay 2 to 3 times what the government's Medicare program pays for the identical service. Medicaid, the program for low-income patients, often pays even less than Medicare, sometimes less than it actually costs the hospital to provide the care. And the uninsured patient who walked in through the emergency room under EMTALA frequently pays nothing at all. Read that again. The same knee replacement can be a healthy profit on a commercial patient, a break-even on a Medicare patient, a guaranteed loss on a Medicaid patient, and pure charity on an uninsured one. The hospital doesn't get to choose who walks in. So the profitability of the entire building comes down to the ratio of those 4 kinds of patients, a ratio the owner has almost no control over. This is why 2 identical hospitals can have completely opposite fortunes. One is full of commercial insurance. The other is full of Medicaid and self-pay. Same care, opposite outcome. And there's a twist inside the government side of that payer mix that turns the whole logic of a business upside down. For most inpatient stays, Medicare doesn't pay the hospital based on how much care it actually delivered. It pays a single fixed amount based on the patient's diagnosis through a system called diagnosis-related groups, or DRGs. If a patient comes in with a certain condition, the hospital gets roughly the same lump sum whether that patient goes home in 3 days or lingers for 10. Sit with what that does to the incentives. In almost every other business, the longer a customer stays, the more you earn. In a hospital being paid by DRG, the longer the patient stays, the more money you lose, because you're spending on care against a payment that stopped growing the moment they were admitted. Suddenly, a full bed occupied by a slow-recovering, low-paying patient isn't an asset at all. It's a meter running in the wrong direction. The entire operational obsession with getting patients discharged, keeping the length of stay down, moving people through, isn't heartlessness. It's the direct, cold logic of how the biggest payer in the country actually pays. The third layer is the service mix, and this one is deeply counterintuitive. Most people assume the emergency room is where a hospital makes its money because it's the busiest and most dramatic part of the building. In reality, the emergency room is often a money loser precisely because of EMTALA. It's full of the patients least likely to pay. The real money is somewhere much quieter. It's in the scheduled, elective, high-margin procedures, cardiac surgery, orthopedic joint replacements, cancer treatment, advanced imaging like MRI and CT scans. A planned hip replacement on a well-insured patient is one of the most profitable things a hospital can do. A drunk man with no insurance and a broken arm at 2 in the morning is one of the least. So the busiest, most visible part of the hospital often subsidizes almost nothing, while a quiet surgical wing that the public never really sees carries the entire building. Volume, in other words, is not the same thing as profit. A hospital doesn't win by being busy. It wins by being busy with the right procedures on the right patients. And here's where that fact creates a predator. Once you understand that a handful of scheduled procedures carry the whole hospital, you can guess what happened next. Specialized competitors appeared whose entire business model is to skim off exactly those procedures and nothing else. Physician-owned surgery centers and standalone imaging clinics popped up that do only the profitable, low-risk, well-insured work. They perform the planned knee replacements and the routine scans on the commercial patients. And they never build an emergency room, so they never have to treat anyone under EMTALA. They cherry-pick the cream and leave the full-service hospital down the street holding everything that loses money. The general hospital is legally stuck with the expensive obligation to be everything to everyone, 24 hours a day, while a lean competitor next door quietly walks away with the only patients that were paying for it all. Then there's a fourth category that most people never think about at all: the facility fee, which is an extra charge a hospital can add simply for the service happening inside its walls, on top of what the doctor charges. This one is sneaky and powerful. The identical checkup with the identical doctor can cost dramatically more if that doctor's office is technically owned by a hospital, because now a facility fee gets stapled onto the bill. This is a big part of why hospital systems spent years buying up independent doctors' offices all over their regions. It wasn't only about the doctors. It was about converting an ordinary clinic visit into a hospital visit that could carry that extra fee. The hospital pharmacy, which under a federal program known as 340B, can buy certain drugs at a steep discount and then be reimbursed by insurers at the much higher normal rate, keeping the spread in between. For some hospitals that treat a lot of low-income patients, this drug arbitrage quietly turns into one of the more reliable profit centers in the entire building, a rare place where the numbers actually work in the owner's favor. And then the almost comically ordinary stuff. The parking garage, which in a big city hospital can generate millions of dollars a year from visitors who have no choice but to park there. The cafeteria, the gift shop, the rent from the coffee chain in the lobby. None of these show up in anyone's mental picture of owning a hospital, but for some properties they add up to a meaningful slice of income. And unlike the emergency room, they get paid in full, in cash, every single day. So far, the hospital sounds like a machine that prints money from 4 directions at once. Now here's the other side of the ledger, and it is brutal. The single largest expense is labor, and it dwarfs everything else. Salaries and benefits often eat up more than half of a hospital's entire budget. A hospital never closes. It runs 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, which means you're paying for nurses, technicians, and on-call specialists around the clock, including nights, weekends, and holidays. And nurses are not optional. When there aren't enough of them, hospitals are forced to hire temporary travel nurses at rates that can be double or triple what a staff nurse costs. During the worst of the recent staffing crisis, some hospitals were paying travel nurses well over $200,000 a year, and that single-line item pushed a lot of otherwise healthy hospitals deep into the red. And the staffing bill isn't something an owner can simply cut when times get tight. A few states legally require a minimum number of nurses per patient, and even where the law is silent, you cannot run a safe hospital by thinning out the people keeping patients alive. A large hospital often employs thousands of people and is frequently the single biggest employer in its entire county. That's a payroll that has to be met every 2 weeks, in good years and bad, no matter what the insurance checks look like. Then there are the supplies, and hospitals are at the mercy of a strange market here too. A single surgical procedure can burn through implants, disposable instruments, and drugs that cost thousands of dollars, and the prices are often set by a small number of powerful manufacturers. To fight back, hospitals band together into what are called group purchasing organizations, pooling their buying power to negotiate better prices the way a warehouse club does. It helps, but it doesn't change the basic reality that a huge slice of every dollar walks straight out the door as the physical stuff of medicine, the gowns, the gloves, the gauze, the titanium, the ever more expensive brand-name drugs. On top of the payroll, there's the uncompensated care, the direct financial consequence of EMTALA. American hospitals collectively provide tens of billions of dollars worth of care every year that they are never paid for. That's not a rounding error. That's a permanent hole in the floor of the business that the paying patients have to cover. There's also malpractice insurance, which for certain high-risk specialties like surgery and obstetrics can be staggeringly expensive. And the endless cost of staying compliant with a thick book of regulations that governs everything from how medications are stored to how records are kept. And then there's a cost most people never imagine exists at all. Getting paid is itself a massive, expensive war. Even when a hospital treats an insured patient, the insurance company does not simply hand over the money. It fights the bill. It demands prior authorization before certain procedures, meaning the hospital has to get permission in advance or risk not being paid at all. It denies claims for coding errors, for missing paperwork, for treatments it decides weren't necessary. So hospitals are forced to employ entire armies of people whose only job is to collect money the hospital has already earned. Medical coders translating every treatment into the exact billing codes the insurer demands. Billing specialists filing claims, and appeals teams battling denials one by one. This whole apparatus is called revenue cycle management, and it's one of the quiet reasons American healthcare is so expensive. A meaningful chunk of the cost isn't the medicine at all. It's the enormous clerical trench warfare between the hospital that wants to be paid and the insurer that would prefer not to pay, or at least to pay later. And here's a detail buried inside the cost structure that catches new owners completely off guard. Most of these costs are fixed. They do not shrink when the building is half empty. An operating room has to be fully staffed and ready whether it runs 4 surgeries that day or 1. The emergency room has to be lit and staffed 24 hours a day whether it's slammed or silent. The specialists on call get paid to be available whether or not a single patient needs them. So when patient volume drops or when the paying patients drop and only the non-paying ones remain, the same enormous fixed cost gets spread across a smaller and smaller pile of actual revenue. Empty beds don't just mean lost income. They mean the crushing cost of readiness gets divided among fewer paying patients, which is exactly the kind of pressure that pushes a struggling hospital over the edge. And here's the trap almost nobody sees coming until they own the place. Even a completely full hospital can lose money. This is the counterintuitive heart of the whole business. A hospital can be at 90% capacity, beds full, waiting room packed, and still bleed cash every month. Because being full tells you nothing about who's in those beds. If a large share of them are Medicaid patients paying below cost, and another share are uninsured patients under EMTALA paying nothing, then every full bed can actually be deepening the loss. Occupancy is not the same thing as income. Census, the hospital word for how full you are, is not the same thing as cash. That single distinction is where a staggering number of hospital owners get into serious trouble. And it's why hospitals in poorer areas can be busy and dying at the same time. Before we get to how hospitals actually die, it's worth understanding the one variable that sits underneath everything else, the way interest rates sit under a bank. In banking, a committee in Washington sets the rate that changes the entire business overnight. In hospitals, it's Medicare. The federal government, through the agency that runs Medicare, sets the reimbursement rates for the single largest payer in the entire system. When Washington decides to adjust what it pays for a given procedure, it doesn't just affect government patients. Private insurers often build their own rates as a multiple of the Medicare rate, so a change in the government number ripples across the whole industry. A hospital can be perfectly well-run, well-staffed, and full, and then a policy change hundreds of miles away quietly moves the number that determines whether every procedure it performs makes money or loses it. That is the volatility trap at the center of the business. The revenue model works in the right conditions. The conditions are set by other people, and they can change. It's worth pausing on one particular kind of hospital because it carries a burden the others don't. The big academic medical centers, the teaching hospitals attached to universities, are where new doctors are trained and where the sickest, most complicated cases get sent when smaller hospitals give up. They also run expensive research programs and keep specialized units running that will never make money, like burn units and trauma centers, because someone has to. Many of them double as the safety net hospital for an entire region, the place that ends up treating a huge share of the uninsured. They get some extra government support for this teaching and safety net mission, but that support has been repeatedly targeted for cuts, and it rarely covers the true cost. So the very hospitals doing the hardest, most essential work, training the next generation and catching everyone the system drops, are often the ones running closest to the financial edge. Excellence and profitability in this industry are frequently pulling in opposite directions. There's one more wrinkle worth understanding before the funerals, and it lives on the non-profit side of the industry. Remember that roughly half of American hospitals are non-profit and pay almost no tax in exchange for serving the community. In practice, some of the largest non-profit hospital systems behave a lot like extremely profitable corporations. They sit on billions of dollars in investment reserves, pay their top executives millions of dollars a year, and, in a number of well-documented cases, have aggressively pursued their own patients over unpaid bills, sending debts to collections and even suing families and garnishing wages. This has drawn real scrutiny over whether these tax-exempt giants are actually providing enough charity care to justify the enormous tax break they receive. It's a reminder that in this business, the label on the door, non-profit or for-profit, tells you far less than you'd think about how the money actually behaves. The pressures of the model bend everyone toward the same math, no matter what the paperwork calls them. Now let's talk about how hospitals die, because they die in ways that look impossible from the outside. Rural hospitals have been closing across the country for years. Well over 100 of them have shut down or stopped offering inpatient care since 2010, and researchers count hundreds more considered at risk of closing. It's not because the towns stopped needing them. It's because the payer mix in those towns, heavy on Medicare, Medicaid, and the uninsured, simply cannot generate enough revenue to cover the fixed cost of staying open. When a rural hospital closes, the nearest emergency room can suddenly be an hour's drive away, and studies have linked those closures to real harm for the people left behind. But the math doesn't care about that. The building costs the same to run whether the patients can pay or not, and when they can't, the building eventually goes dark. Then there are the dramatic collapses. In 2019, a large teaching hospital in the middle of Philadelphia called Hahnemann University Hospital shut down after more than a century of operation. It had treated the city's poorest patients for generations, but it had also been serving a payer mix heavy on Medicaid and the uninsured, which meant it was losing money by the millions. It was bought by an investor whose background was in real estate rather than medicine, and within about a year the hospital was in bankruptcy. Part of what sealed its fate was that the land it sat on, in a downtown core, was arguably worth more as prime real estate for development than the hospital was worth full of patients who couldn't pay. When the ground under a hospital becomes more valuable than the hospital's own business, the building itself becomes the endangered species, and the people who depended on it become collateral damage. And that brings us back to the arrangement from the beginning of the story, the one where owners sold their hospital's real estate and rented the buildings back. In 2024, a large for-profit hospital chain called Steward Healthcare collapsed into one of the biggest hospital bankruptcies in modern American history. It ran more than 30 hospitals across roughly 8 states and filed for bankruptcy owing billions. And a major thread running through its downfall was exactly that structure. Years earlier, it had sold the real estate under its hospitals to that specialized landlord, Medical Properties Trust, and taken the cash. The company no longer owned the ground under many of its own hospitals. It owed rent on them. So on top of all the normal pressures, thin margins, brutal labor costs, a difficult payer mix, it was also writing enormous rent checks for buildings it once owned outright. When the money got tight, that fixed rent became an anchor, and hospitals that served entire communities went down with the company. The lesson underneath it is the same one that runs through every part of this business. The moment your fixed costs outrun the money your patients can actually generate, no amount of full beds will save you. So let's put some rough numbers on it. Say you own a mid-sized hospital, and it brings in, on paper, hundreds of millions of dollars in charges a year. Remember, the charges are the fiction. What you actually collect, after the chargemaster gets negotiated down, after Medicare pays its set rate, after Medicaid pays below cost, after the uninsured pay nothing, is a fraction of that. Out of what you actually collect, more than half immediately vanishes into labor. Then supplies, drugs, equipment, insurance, utilities on a building that never sleeps, and the endless cost of regulation eat most of the rest. Let's make it concrete. Imagine your hospital bills out $400 million in charges over a year. On the chargemaster, that looks enormous. But after every payer knocks the number down to what they've actually agreed to pay, the real collected revenue might be more like $200 million. Out of that $200 million, well over $100 million disappears into salaries and benefits before you've bought a single bandage. Another large chunk goes to drugs and supplies. Tens of millions more go to utilities, insurance, equipment, technology, the billing army, and interest on the bonds you borrowed to build the place. When you finish subtracting, you might be left with $4, $5, maybe $6 million of actual profit on $200 million collected. That's the 2 or 3 cents on the dollar reality. When the dust settles, a typical hospital operates on an extraordinarily thin margin, and in bad years, no profit at all. Think about how little cushion that is. A business selling coffee keeps more of each dollar than a hospital does. That is the good scenario. Now, the bad scenario. The government trims Medicare reimbursement. A big local employer leaves town, and your best-paying commercial patients leave with it, replaced by more Medicaid and more uninsured. A nursing shortage forces you back into expensive travel staff. Any one of those, on a business already running on a few cents per dollar, can flip the whole hospital from a thin profit to a steady monthly loss. And unlike most businesses, you can't respond by turning away the unprofitable customers, because the law won't let you. You have to keep the lights on, keep the emergency room open, and keep treating everyone who walks in, whether or not the money is there. Hospitals are one of the most essential institutions in the entire economy. A town without one is a town in trouble. But essential is not the same as profitable, and needed is not the same as paid. This is the industry where a business can be completely full, absolutely vital to its community, staffed by brilliant people doing life-saving work, and still slide quietly into bankruptcy because the people who need it most are often the ones least able to pay for it, and the law, correctly, does not let anyone be turned away. So, if you do decide to own a hospital, understand what you are actually buying. You are not buying a building full of beds. You are not buying a stable, recession-proof stream of income. You are buying a machine that turns sickness into money everywhere except the emergency room, that runs entirely on who happens to walk through the door and who happens to be paying their bill, and that answers to a rate set by a government agency you will never meet. The beds are the easy part. The bed is everything.